Hello and welcome to the session on content theory, Frege and Husserl. Beginning with Frege's sense and reference. The origins of content theory can be traced to Gottlob Frege's seminal work of 1892 called On Sense and Reference. Before we can discuss what sense and reference meant for Frege, let us consider a simple equation as A is equal to B. What we mean to say here is A is equal to B. Let us move away from the algebraic and arithmetical assumptions we may have in our minds. We are not talking about value here. If we were to do that, we would say A is equal to A, where A could be substituted by 4, 5 or any other digit, and the equation would be read as 4 is equal to 4. Instead, when we say A is equal to B, we are talking about identity or linguistic reference. Linguistic reference, simply put, is reference using language. With Frege, we are then moving away from mental reference, mental acts, etc. to linguistic reference and the relationship between the two forms of reference. Frege does not really think about acts, contents and objects, but of expressions, senses and reference. We use the term referent instead of reference because reference indicates the act of referring and referent the object or entity referred to. There is nevertheless a one-to-one relationship between the term used to signify mental and linguistic references in Frege's scheme. If we were to represent it in a simple form, we could do it thus: expression is equal to act, sense is equal to content, referent is equal to object. Let us go back to the equation A is equal to B. The question that arises here is, does A is equal to B signify a relationship between objects signified by A and B, or is it a relationship between the linguistic terms A and B? If we were to regard equality or identity as a relationship between the objects that A and B stand for, it would seem that A is equal to B is the same as A is equal to A, provided A is equal to B is true. A relation would be expressed of a thing to itself. It would be a relation in which each thing stands to itself and to no other thing. What is meant to be said by A is equal to B is that the signs or names refer to the same entity or object. What then needs to be discussed is the relationship between A and B as linguistic terms or signs or names. The relationship, however, between the names or signs would hold only if they stood for or referred to something. It would be meaningful only in a context where A and B refer to the same thing. If we say that the morning star is the same as the evening star, we do not mean that there are two entities. Instead, we mean that there is one entity to which we refer by using two different expressions or names or signs. The expression morning star and evening star have different senses or meanings. This is because they represent their referent, the planet Venus, in different ways. According to Frege, the mode of presentation of Venus is different when we use different expressions to refer to it. Morning star presents the morning aspect of Venus and evening star its evening aspect. Equality or identity then is a relation not between two entities but between two names. Thus, with a name or linguistic term or sign is connected not just an entity to which it refers or which is the referent, but also what is called the sense of the sign or the mode of presentation included within it. In the example given above, the reference of the evening star would be the same as that of the morning star, but not the sense. Sign and name, as we gather from this context, represent a proper name which has as its reference a definite object. A single object can be represented using different words or signs. The relationship between an expression or sign, its sense and its reference can be summed up thus. To an expression or sign corresponds a definite sense, to this definite senses a definite reference, while to a given reference or object there can be more than a single sign. In other words, the same sense has different expressions or signs in different languages or even in the same language. Every sign has a sense, but this is not to say that to every sense corresponds a reference. The words, the heavenly body closest to the earth, has a sense but not a reference. With words used in the ordinary way, what one is speaking of is their reference. There are times when we talk only about signs or names and their sense. Frege solved one of the problems of reference, that of referring to one single object or entity by means of two different senses. The problem of referring to non-existent objects he solved by saying that every sign or expression has a sense but not necessarily a referent. He writes, in grasping a sense, one is not certainly assured of a reference. The expressions center, chimera and the lowest common multiple or LCM, as our mathematics textbooks refer to them, do not have reference, but each of them has a sense of its own. If senses were determined by reference, then the case would have been that these expressions do not have senses because they do not have reference. But this is not the case. To sum up Frege's proposition, a sign or an expression refers to its referent through its sense. The relation of referring between a sign or expression and its referent can be best represented thus: expression or sign, referent, refers, has, determines, expression, sense, referent. Frege, sense and idea. The question that we now begin to encounter is, what do we mean by sense, or what sort of entities are senses? According to Frege, the reference and sense of a sign are to be distinguished from mental events or ideas, as he calls them. If the reference of a sign is an object that can be perceived by the senses, the idea of it is an internal image. This internal image evolves from memories of sense impressions which I have experienced and acts or events, both internal and external, or mental and physical, which I have performed. An idea often contains feeling. The same sense is not always connected, even in the same person with the same idea. We call the idea subjective. It varies from one human thinking subject to another human thinking subject. One man's idea is not the same as that of another. Hence, we can observe a variety of differences in ideas related to the same sense. Let us take the example of Alexander's great horse Bucephalus, one of the most famous horses in history. The sign or proper name Bucephalus has a definite object for a referent, which is Alexander's horse. The sense that it evokes is also the same. It is that of Alexander's horse. However, the idea that Bucephalus evokes in a painter, a horseman and a zoologist are all very different. For a painter, the idea of Bucephalus may be one of great beauty, legendary, strength, grandeur, etc. and the representation of these in painting, while for a horseman it may be strength, vigor and prowess in battle, on the racetrack, etc. For a zoologist, the idea may be altogether different. He may be concerned with the breed of the horse that makes it stronger than and superior to other breeds of horses. This example tells us of an essential distinction between the idea and the sense attached to the sign. The sign may be a common property of many people. It is something that several people can have in common and therefore not a part or mode of the individual mind. Frege adds that we cannot deny that mankind has a common store of thoughts, and thoughts are senses evoked by expressions or signs, which is transmitted from one generation to another. Going by this observation of Frege, we can talk in a rather simple and unproblematic manner of sense. However, when we talk of an idea, we must be careful to include or at least be aware of the person or mind to whom it belongs and at what time it evolved. Two individual minds can grasp the same sense but cannot have the same idea. If two persons conceive the same object, each of them would still have his or her own idea. Frege's distinction between sense and idea was in stark opposition to the psychologistic view prevalent at the time, which propounded that there are only individual minds and ideas, but no universally shared meanings or senses at all. The view opposed to psychologism is generally called conceptual realism. The premise of conceptual realism is that in addition to individual ideas, there also exist shared meanings. Like Frege's propositions, the object theories of Twardowski and Meinong are also alternatives to psychologism, for they too held that the world of objects is independent of but understandable by individual human thinking subjects. Nevertheless, there is a significant difference between the anti-psychologistic theories of Twardowski and Meinong on the one hand and Frege's theory on the other. Let us look at how it is so. The referent of an expression is normally a totally objective thing existing in the world. The idea related to the expression or sign, on the other hand, is totally subjective. Every person has his or her own idea for the same expression, although they all have a similar sense of it. The sense of an expression falls somewhere in between the referent and our ideas. Frege illustrates this point using an example. I observe the moon through a telescope. I compare the moon itself to the reference. The moon is the object of observation. The moon for me is mediated by the real image projected by the glass of the telescope and the image of it formed on my retina. The former, or the real image mediated by the telescope, can be compared to the sense, while the latter, the image of it formed on my retina is like the idea or experience. The former can be grasped by anybody who has the faculty of vision and in an objective manner, whereas the latter is my own individual visual experience mediated by my retina. Based on Frege's distinctions, we can now distinguish between three distinct senses in which two persons can be said to think of the same thing. First, their mental experiences could be exactly similar. They think not only of the same thing through the same sense, but they can also have exactly the same idea. Such an occurrence is rare in actual experience, but there is no logical reason as to why the same idea should not occur to two different individuals if they have had exactly similar experiences up to the smallest detail. This variety of sameness of thought could be called idea sameness. Now, two individuals can be said to think of the same thing when they have different ideas, even when they have the same sense of it. This situation can be called sense sameness. In a different situation, two individuals can be said to think of the same thing even when they have different senses corresponding to the same object of referent. For instance, my friend thinking of the morning star and I thinking of the evening star. This variety of sameness could be called referent sameness. Husserl's content theory. Edmund Husserl was the first to develop a comprehensive account of content theory in his book of 1900, Logical Investigations. His theory was a detailed phenomenological theory of mental reference, which we will engage within this unit. The basic premise of Husserl's thinking was that the object of an experience is not a part of the experience precisely because an experience could be directed to an object that does not exist. He uses an example of the idea of the Greek god Jupiter to illustrate this. He writes, "I have an idea of the god Jupiter, which means that I have a certain experience of Jupiter as an object of presentation in my consciousness. It is in my consciousness that the presentation of the god Jupiter is realized. This intentional experience may be fragmented. These fragments will form parts of my description of Jupiter, but in my experience cannot be found Jupiter. This mental object, that is Jupiter, is not part of my experience, whether in a descriptive or real sense. It is actually speaking not a mental or extramental object, since it does not exist at all. It is only its content that is found within the mind, and content may refer either to what Frege called idea or, better still, what he called sense. Husserl, having taken up the distinction between the two, asserted that only the idea or the real content, as he called it, is a part of the act. The real contents are not intentional but constitute the act. These acts render possible an intentional experience, but are not themselves intended or are the objects presented in the act. I do not, for example, see colors, but only colored objects. There are components, fragments out of which an act is constructed. The object to which the act is directed is not a fragment or a part of the act in that sense. The real content, we must remember, is not itself that which lends intentionality to the act. Instead, it is the ideal content or the objective sense which directs the act to the object, although it is not a part of the act. The ideal content belongs to the ideal sphere of concepts. We can erase the word star written on a piece of paper, but an individual cannot completely forget or destroy the concept of the cat. Likewise, we can prevent a given real content in some individual mental act from occurring, but we cannot destroy the corresponding ideal content. Just as one cannot understand the word star without knowing the concept of the star, so a real content of an act is directed to an object or becomes intentional only by attaching itself to a given ideal content. Apart from the distinction that Husserl makes between ideal and real contents, he differentiates a third order of things, which is the order of existing things. Neither ideal or real contents exist in the world in the sense in which human beings, trees, houses, etc. exist. In other words, they do not exist in the real sense. Husserl uses the word real, ideal and actual in the sense respectively of 1. Mental events, 2. Concepts and 3. Concrete particulars. When Husserl uses the word real, he does not refer to real existence, that is actual existence in the world, but to existence in a person's consciousness. The word content for Husserl means the ideal content. Content theory in a nutshell. The content theory of intentionality can be summed up as follows. An act is intentional if and only if it has a content. It is the content that determines to which object the act refers. There are objectless acts as well. By this, we mean that the content of an act may fail to determine an object for the act in question. These properties or features can be represented thus: elements that necessarily belong to an act form the second component in the illustration. Elements that can or not have an act form the third component. An arrow running from the second to the third component indicates that it is the third component to which the act is directed. Frege, expression, sense, referent. Husserl, act, content, object. The illustration states the following things. The expression or act has a sense or content, but is not directed to it. The sense or content acts as a mediating aspect between the expression or act and its referent object. The expression or act refers to its referent or object if it has one. Let me summarize what we have discussed so far. In this unit on content theory, we observed that Frege's theory is not about mental reference, but about linguistic reference and the relationship between linguistic and mental references. We explored Frege's understanding of the relationship between an expression or sign, its sense and its reference. We witnessed how Frege's distinction between sense and idea was in stark opposition to the psychologistic view prevalent at the time. The psychologistic view, which propounded that there are only individual minds and ideas, but no universally shared meanings or senses at all. We also discussed the differences between the anti-psychologistic theories of Twardowski and Meinong on the one hand and Frege's theory on the other. We saw that the basic premise of Husserl's thinking was that the object of an experience is not a part of the experience precisely because an experience could be directed to an object that does not exist. Finally, we summarized the basic characteristics of content theory in the last module. Now, you can try to answer the questions given here. What does equality or identity mean in Frege's scheme of things? Explain how Frege solved the problem of reference. Why should we be careful when we talk about an idea as against sense according to Frege. What are the fundamental features of the content theory of intentionality? What, according to Husserl, lends intentionality to a mental act? Explain. Discuss the relationship between an expression, its sense and reference. Why do we observe a variety of differences in ideas related to the same sense? Hope that you can go through the books listed here for reference. Introduction to Phenomenology by Dermot Moran, Routledge, London, 2000. The New Husserl, A Critical Reader by Don Welton, Indiana University Press, 2003. Thank you for watching this program. We will meet again with another topic soon. Till then, take care.